The Arizona sun is a merciless god, and for the widow, Cordelia May Thompson, its daily benediction was a curse of dust and memory. For 6 months since the fever took her, Franklin, the silence of their modest ranch, had been a living thing, broken only by the thin cries of her son and the weary creak of the porch swing. But on a Tuesday, as the sky bled into a bruised twilight, a new silence fell. It was a weighted, watchful silence that raised the hair on her arms. A man stood at her fence line, as still and stark as a dead yucca. He wasn't a cowboy nor a prospector. He was Apache, his form lean and hard as the land itself. When he finally moved, it was with the fluid deadliness of a panther, and when he spoke, his voice was like gravel and smoke, carrying a promise that would either be her salvation or her damnation. By dawn, he vowed, his dark eyes locking onto hers, "You'll belong to me alone." The air in the cinder basin was so dry, it felt as if it could crack open the sky. For Cordelia May Thompson, it had already cracked open her life. 6 months, 184 days since she'd buried her husband Franklin on the little rise overlooking the parched creek bed. The doctor from Redemption Gulch had called it a lung fever, swift and final. But to Cordelia it felt like the land itself had simply reclaimed him, pulling him back into the dust from which he'd fought so hard to carve a life. Her world had shrunk to the 30 acres of their homestead, the sturdy but lonely cabin Franklin had built with his own hands, and the small, bright presence of her 8-year-old son, Wyatt. He had his father's honest blue eyes, and a solemnity that no boy his age should possess. On this particular evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple, Wyatt was chasing horned toads near the chicken coop. Cordelia watched him from the porch, her Winchester .73 leaning against the wall beside her, a permanent extension of her arm these days. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with things left unsaid and dangers that lurked just beyond the failing light. That's when she saw him. He hadn't ridden up. He hadn't made a sound. He was simply there, standing by the far post of the horse corral, a silhouette against the dying light. He was tall for an Apache, clad in buckskin leggings and a simple cloth shirt. A leather band held back a cascade of jet-black hair. He carried no rifle she could see, only a sheathed knife at his hip and a bow in his hand. But it was his stillness that terrified her. It was the stillness of a predator that knows its prey is already caught. Wyatt saw him too. The boy froze, his small game forgotten, and scrambled back to the porch, hiding behind his mother's skirts. Cordelia's hand went to the cool, familiar stock of her Winchester. "State your business," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man moved, flowing over the dusty ground rather than walking. He stopped 20 yards from the porch, close enough now for her to see the sharp planes of his face, the unreadable depth of his obsidian eyes. There were faint scars on one cheek, old stories written on his skin. "You are the woman of Franklin Thompson," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I am his widow." The word still tasted like ash in her mouth. "Who's asking my people call me mangas? The white men who fear me call me mangas." His English was precise, honed with none of the clipped uncertainty she was used to from natives who came to trade. "I have come to collect on a debt." Cordelia's mind raced. Franklin was a good man, an honest man. He didn't run up debts. My husband owed no one. We paid our way. Mangas took another step closer. Some debts are not paid in coin. They are paid in blood. And in promises. He raised a hand, and for a terrifying second she thought he was making a sign to unseen companions. But his hand was empty, His gesture meant only for her. 5 winters ago in the Greybone Canyon, your husband found me. I was gored by a boar, my leg broken. The coyotes were singing my death song. He did not pass me by. He did not put a bullet in me, as others would have. He splintered my leg with branches from his saddle axe and gave me the last of his water. He saved my life. Cordelia remembered the story vaguely. Franklin had come home, late his canteen empty, saying he'd given water to a struggling traveler. He'd never mentioned the man was Apache. In this territory, such kindness was often seen as foolishness. He was a good man, she whispered, her grip on the rifle slackening slightly. He was Mungar's agreed. And he accepted my vow. A life for a life. I swore to him that if his path ever ended, before the sun set on his days, I would watch over what he left behind. I would become the guardian of his legacy. His eyes burned into hers, and the air grew thick with a sudden, suffocating intensity. He took the final steps to the edge of her porch, close enough now that she could smell the scent of sage and clean earth on him. The vultures are circling your land, Cordelia May Thompson. They think you are weak, alone. He looked past her at Wyatt, peeking from behind her. They are wrong. Franklin Thompson's debt is now due. I am here to pay it. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to encompass the entire homestead in his grasp. His voice dropped to a low, resonant promise that vibrated through the wooden planks beneath her feet. I have given my word. I will not fail him. By dawn, he declared, his gaze locking with hers, and holding her captive, "You'll belong to me alone." The words hung in the air, a threat and a vow intertwined. It was not a proposal of marriage or a declaration of love. It sounded like a sentence, a claim of ownership. To Cordelia, alone in the vast, unforgiving wilderness with her son, it was the most terrifying thing she had ever heard. The sun vanished completely, and in the sudden chill of the desert night, she felt truly, utterly trapped. Sleep did not come. Cordelia sat in her rocking chair by the cold hearth, the Winchester laid across her lap, watching the moon crawl across the star-dusted sky. Every creak of the cabin, every hoot of a distant owl was the sound of Mangus's approach. He had not stayed. After delivering his chilling edict, he had melted back into the darkness as silently as he had appeared, leaving Cordelia's world tilted on its axis. "You'll belong to me alone." What did it mean? Was he some madman twisting Franklin's kindness into a crazed obsession? The Apache were a proud people, she knew, and they held to their codes of honor. But this felt like something more primal, more possessive. She was not a stray calf to be claimed. She was Franklin's wife. Now his widow, her own woman. By morning, raw-nerved and exhausted, she had convinced herself it was a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by grief and fear. She lit the stove, her movements brisk and determined. There was coffee to be made, chickens to feed a son to raise. There was no room in her life for Apache phantoms and their cryptic promises. The first vulture appeared 2 days later, in a dust cloud of buckboard and bluster. Bartholomew Bart Higgins was a man who seemed to have been born sweating. He was large and florid, his expensive suit stained at the collar, his waistcoat barely containing a prosperous belly. He owned the vast H-Bar-H ranch that bordered her property to the north, and had made no secret of his desire to absorb her modest homestead. He reined in his horses and heaved himself down from the wagon, a practiced look of sorrow plastered on his face. "Cordelia, my dear," he boomed, removing his hat to reveal a bald, sun-spotted scalp. "I was just passing by on my way from town. Wanted to see how you and the boy were holding up." "We're managing, Mr. Higgins," Cordelia said coolly, stepping onto the porch. She did not invite him to sit. Wyatt, who had been mending a fence link, retreated to her side, his small face distrustful. "It's a hard thing, a woman alone out here," Higgins said, his eyes scanning her property, lingering on the well and the small but healthy-looking herd of cattle in the distance. "A damn hard thing. This land, it requires a man's hand. Franklin, bless his soul, he knew that." "Franklin taught me well enough," she replied, her voice clipped. Higgins sighed, a wheezing, theatrical sound. Of course. You're a strong woman, none can deny it. But strength can't make the rain fall or keep the wolves at bay. I'm just saying my offer still stands. I'll give you a fair price for the land. More than fair. Enough to set you and the boy up comfortably in a nice boarding house in Tucson. No more dust, no more fear. The answer is the same as it was a month ago, Mr. Higgins. This is my home. It was my husband's home. It will be my son's home. We're not selling." A flicker of annoyance crossed Higgins's face before it was smoothed over with his greasy sympathy. Stubborn just like him. I respect that. But pride is a luxury, my dear. Think of the boy. He winked at Wyatt, who shrank further behind his mother. Just keep the offer in mind. He lumbered back to his buckboard and drove off, leaving a trail of dust and unease. Cordelia knew what he wanted her water. The creek that ran through her land, though nearly dry now at the end of summer, was the only reliable water source for miles during the spring thaw. Higgins's own wells were deep, but they weren't infinite. The second and third vultures came the next night. They were Higgins's men, Pete and Lyle. Pete was a wiry man with shifty eyes and a nervous tic. Lyle was a hulking brute who moved with a sullen slowness. They weren't subtle. Cordelia was woken by the panicked lowing of her cattle. Grabbing the Winchester, she raced outside. The herd was scattered, running wildly the gate to their night pasture swinging open. In the moonlight, she saw two figures on horseback, hooting and waving their hats, driving the animals towards the broken fence line at the far end of her property. "Get off my land," she screamed, firing a shot into the air. The riders laughed their voices, carrying on the night air. They didn't even turn back. They simply vanished into the darkness, leaving her with a racing heart and a night's work of rounding up terrified livestock. It took her until nearly sunrise to find them all huddled in a dry wash 2 miles away. The next day, her well rope was cut. A simple act of malice, but it meant she had to spend 2 hours painstakingly retrieving the bucket and splicing the rope, her hands raw and bleeding. She knew she had to go to the law. Sheriff Brody in Redemption Gulch was a decent man, but he was past his prime, weary of the constant squabbles between ranchers and miners. She rode into town, the dust of the 30-mile journey clinging to her dress. Brody listened patiently from behind his cluttered desk, stroking his graying mustache. "Cordelia, I hear you," he said when she'd finished her story, which tumbled out in a rush of anger and fear. "But what have you got?" Spooked cattle could have been a mountain lion. A cut rope could have been frayed and snapped on its own. "You have no proof it was Higgins's men. Who else would it be?" she demanded. "He wants my land, Brody. He's trying to scare me out, Bart. Higgins is a founding member of this town," the sheriff said tiredly. "He sits on the council. He pays a lot of taxes. My hands are tied without proof. You see Pete or Lyle on your property, again you come get me. Until then, I suggest you be careful." She rode home, a cold ball of despair settling in her stomach. The law was a distant, toothless thing. Higgins was the real power here. She was alone. The word echoed in her mind, a hollow, tolling bell. That night, as she sat on the porch, cleaning her rifle with methodical, angry movements, she felt that familiar, watchful stillness again. She looked up and Mangus was there, standing not at the fence line, but at the edge of the porch light's reach, just beyond the circle of safety. He held something in his hand. He stepped forward and placed it gently on the porch railing. It was a single long black feather from a raven tied with a thin strip of sinew to a shard of dark, smoky quartz. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. "The men who cut your well rope. They will find this at their bunkhouse door tomorrow," he said. "Among my people the raven is a messenger. It sees all things. This tells them they have been watched. It is a warning." He had seen them. He had been here watching, and she hadn't even known. You said I would belong to you," she said, the words catching in her throat. "What do you want from me?" Mangus's eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time she saw something beyond the stoic warrior's mask. It wasn't lust or greed. It was a fierce, unwavering intensity, an ancient sorrow. "I want you to live," he said simply. "I want the son of the man who saved my life to grow tall. That is all. The promise I made was not for me. It was for him." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, as if he were a part of it. Cordelia stared at the raven's feather. It was a piece of the wilderness, a symbol of a law far older than Sheriff Brody's. It was a warning, yes, but it was also a promise of a different kind. She was still terrified, but for the first time in 6 months, she felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead hope. And it was just as frightening as the fear. The black feather worked its grim magic. For a week, an uneasy peace settled over the Thompson homestead. The cattle remained calm, the well rope stayed intact, and there were no more shadowy riders in the night. Cordelia found herself scanning the horizon, not just for threats, but for a sign of her silent protector. She never saw him, but she felt his presence, a subtle shift in the air, a sense of being watched over that was slowly transforming from unnerving to comforting. Wyatt felt it too. The boy who had been quiet and withdrawn since his father's death began to venture further from the cabin. One afternoon, Cordelia found him near the creek bed, holding a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird. It was a hawk, its wings outstretched, every feather detailed with impossible precision. "Where did you get that, Wyatt?" she asked, her heart giving a little jump. "The quiet man gave it to me." Wyatt said, his eyes shining. "He was here. He showed me how to track a rabbit by its footprints." Cordelia's blood ran cold. "He was here. When did he speak to you just now?" "He doesn't talk much. He said the hawk watches from above and sees the whole story. He said my father was a hawk." Wyatt clutched the carving to his chest, a treasure more precious than gold. The idea of this strange, dangerous man being so close to her son sent a fresh wave of fear through her. But it was tangled with something else. He hadn't harmed Wyatt. He had given him a gift, a connection to the father he missed so dearly. Mangus was not just a warrior. He was something more complex, and his motivations were buried deeper than she could fathom. That evening, she decided to confront the mystery head-on. She left Wyatt inside with a book and a plate of biscuits, took a lantern, and walked out towards the small cluster of cottonwoods that grew by the creek, the place she most often felt his presence. "Mangus," she called into the darkness, her voice surprisingly firm. "I know you're out there. Show yourself. We need to talk." Silence answered her. The wind whispered through the dry leaves. She was about to turn back, feeling foolish, when he stepped from behind the trunk of the largest cottonwood. He hadn't been hiding. The shadows had simply held him until he chose to be seen. "You called," he said, his voice calm. "You spoke with my son," she said, her tone accusatory. "You came onto my property near my child without my permission." "He was not in danger from me," Mangus replied, his gaze unwavering. The danger comes from the man in the big house. The man who sweats lies. "Higgins," she breathed. "His men have stayed away. Your message worked." "It is a temporary peace," he said, stepping closer, the lantern light catching the sharp lines of his face. "A snake, when startled, will retreat to its hole, but it will strike again when it is hungry." He paused, and his next words changed everything. "You believe your husband died of a fever?" Cordelia stiffened. "The doctor said." "The doctor saw what he was told to see." Mangus interrupted his voice, dropping low, laced with a cold anger. "Franklin Thompson was a strong man. He worked this land for 5 years. He knew its rhythms, its hardships. A fever does not take such a man in one night." "What are you saying?" she whispered, though she already knew. A dark suspicion she had buried deep within herself was clawing its way to the surface. Franklin hadn't been a sickly man. He'd been hale and hearty one day, then coughing and delirious the next gone, before the doctor could even make the ride from town. "I have been watching this valley since I made my vow to your husband," Mangus explained. "Not just your land, but the land around it. For months, Bart Higgins has been building a dam far up the creek in the canyons on government land where no one goes. It is small, hidden. He diverts a trickle of the water, a little more each week, into a hidden reservoir on his own property. By next spring, when the thaw comes, his reservoir will be full. And this creek," he gestured to the dry bed at their feet, "will be a ghost. Your land will turn to a wasteland. Your cattle will die. You will be forced to sell to him for pennies." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The desperation in Higgins's offers his obsession with her land. "Franklin." Her voice was barely audible. "What happened to Franklin?" I tracked the story backward. Mangas said, his eyes filled with a grim certainty. 2 days before he fell ill, his horse went lame near the canyon. He would have walked the creek bed home. He would have seen the dam. He was an honest man. He would have confronted Higgins. Mangas reached into a pouch at his belt and held something out on his palm. In the flickering lantern light, Cordelia saw a small, dried, purplish-black flower. "This is called mangusweed by my people. Night's kiss by yours. It grows in the damp, dark places of the mountains. A small amount brewed in tea or whiskey brings on a fierce fever, a fire in the lungs. It mimics the lung sickness. A larger dose is fatal. It leaves no trace that a town doctor would recognize." Cordelia stared at the flower, and the image of Franklin's last hours flooded her memory. His gasping breaths, his confused, fever-bright eyes, the way he'd clutched his chest. It hadn't been a fever. It had been poison. He had been murdered. A strangled sob escaped her lips, a raw sound of grief and rage. The world seemed to tilt and blur. She stumbled back, and strong hands caught her arm, steadying her. It was Mangus. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it was the only thing holding her up. "He killed him!" She choked out tears streaming down her face. "That monster. He murdered my husband for a patch of dirt and a trickle of water." "Yes," Mangus said, his voice a stone in the darkness. "He did. And the law of the white man will not touch him. Sheriff Brody is a weak reed in the wind. Higgins owns that town." She looked up at him, her eyes burning with a newfound, terrible fire. The grief was still there, a gaping wound, but now it was forged with a cold, hard resolve. Higgins wouldn't just get her land. He would get away with murdering her husband. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "No, he won't." Mangas watched her, his expression unreadable but intense. He saw the shift in her, the lonely widow, transforming into an instrument of vengeance. "The debt I owe Franklin Thompson is not just to protect you," he said softly, releasing her arms as she straightened up. "It is to see justice done for his death. My law is older than the sheriff's. My justice is cleaner." In that moment, under the silent witness of the stars, the nature of his vow became terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just a guardian. He was an executioner, and he was asking her, the grieving widow, to sanction his brand of justice. The line between savior and savage blurred, and Cordelia knew that to save her home and avenge her husband, she would have to cross it with him. The revelation of Franklin's murder did not break Cordelia. It tempered her. The grief that had been a soft, smothering blanket became a sharp, cold blade. The fear that had paralyzed her coiled into righteous fury. She looked at her son sleeping soundly in his small bed and knew she was fighting not just for a piece of land, but for the very memory of his father, for a world where such evil did not go unpunished. Her relationship with Mangas underwent a profound shift. He was no longer a mysterious threat or a reluctant guardian. He became an ally, a weapon. He began to spend more time near the homestead, no longer confining himself to the shadows. He moved with a quiet purpose, his presence becoming a part of the ranch's daily rhythm. He taught her things, not with long speeches, but with quiet demonstrations. He showed her how to read the land, to see the subtle signs of passage, a bent blade of grass, a displaced pebble. He pointed out the paths the deer took, explaining how they could also be used by men wishing to approach unseen. He taught her how to bank her fire so it produced less smoke, a small detail that could mean the difference between being seen and being invisible. In turn, Cordelia found herself sharing her world with him. One evening, as he cleaned a rabbit he had caught for their supper, she sat on the porch steps, mending one of Wyatt's shirts. "Franklin always said this land was honest," she said, not looking at him. "It gives you nothing you don't earn. It can kill you with its heat or its cold, but it never lies." It was men like Higgins he couldn't abide. Men who smile to your face and carry a poisoned flower in their pocket. Mangas paused, his knife still. "Your husband understood honor." "He did," she affirmed. "He would have respected you." She looked at him, then truly looked at him, seeing past the warrior to the man. What will happen? Mangas after. This, he met her gaze. Higgins will not stop. He knows his first attempts failed. His snake-like patience is wearing thin. Soon he will strike with his full venom. He will come for the ranch, and he will not leave you alive to tell the tale. You are the only loose end to the story of Franklin's death. So we wait for him to attack, we prepare, Mangas corrected. We turn his strength, his numbers against him. This land you call honest, we will make it lie for us. We will make it his enemy. A fragile, unspoken trust began to grow between them. It was a bond forged in a shared purpose in the space between her grief and his code of honor. Wyatt, oblivious to the deadly currents swirling around them, began to idolize the Apache warrior. He followed Mangas around the property, asking endless questions, which Mangas would answer with quiet patience. He showed Wyatt how to fletch an arrow not for killing, but for practice, for discipline. He taught him the names of the stars his people used to navigate. For the first time since Franklin's passing, Cordelia heard her son laugh a full-throated, joyous sound as Mangas demonstrated how to mimic a coyote's call. In that moment, watching the stoic warrior and the lonely boy, a strange and poignant scene unfolded against the backdrop of their impending war. A phantom of a family she never could have imagined. The planning began in earnest. They walked every inch of her property. Mangas's mind was a map of strategy and tactics. The shallow ravine behind the barn became a kill zone, the cottonwood grove a perfect spot for an ambush, the cabin itself their fortress. He will bring at least 4 men besides himself, Mangas, assessed one afternoon, crouching near the front porch and sketching in the dirt with a stick. Pete and Lyle, and probably 2 more guns he keeps at his ranch. They are cowboys, not fighters. They are used to open land and straight fights. They will not be expecting a war in the shadows. They worked together, reinforcing the cabin. They barred the windows with heavy wooden planks that could be dropped into place quickly. Cordelia gathered every round of ammunition she had, laying them out on the kitchen table. She had her Winchester Franklin's old Colt revolver and a double-barreled shotgun. "I can shoot," she told Mangas, her voice steady. "Franklin taught me. I can hit a running jackrabbit at 50 yards. Good," he said, nodding. "A rabbit does not shoot back, but the principle is the same. Aim for the center. Do not waste a shot. Make each one a final word." One evening, as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, the silence between them was comfortable familiar. "Why did you take the name Mangas?" Cordelia asked softly. He looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. "When my family was taken to the reservation at San Carlos, I was young. I saw the spirit of my people dying in that place. The warriors became ghosts. I didn't want to be a ghost. I wanted to be the darkness that the ghosts hide in. A shadow that could move where others could not see what others could not. A shadow that remembers. And what do you remember? I remember. The promises that were broken by your people," he said, without malice, stating a fact. "And I remember the one promise that was kept." He looked at her. "The promise your husband made to a dying man in a canyon. That is a memory worth fighting for." The air thickened, charged with an emotion she couldn't name. His vow, "By dawn you'll belong to me," alone echoed in her mind. It had once sounded like a cage. Now it felt like a shield. It was a statement of absolute, unwavering commitment. He had bound his fate to hers, his honor to her survival. He was claiming responsibility for her son, for the memory of his friend. In the brutal calculus of the West, it was the most profound declaration she had ever heard. A rider was spotted the next day, far out on the ridge overlooking her valley. He watched the homestead for an hour before turning back toward the H-bar-H. He sends a scout, Mangas, said, his eyes narrowed, to see how the widow is faring, to see if she is packing her wagon or digging in her heels. What did he see? Cordelia asked, her hand instinctively going to the pistol tucked in her belt. He saw smoke from the chimney. He saw a boy playing in the yard. He saw a woman who has not run. Mangas stood up his body, tensing every line of him, alert and ready. And that will be her death warrant. Tell your son to stay inside after the sun sets. The snake is done rattling. Tonight it strikes. As dusk settled, the vibrant colors of the sky seemed like a cruel mockery of the grim reality below. The air grew still and cold, pregnant with violence. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was taut as a bowstring. Cordelia had fed Wyatt an early supper, her hands moving with a mechanical calm she did not feel. She told him they were going to play a quiet game, a hiding game, and that he had to be absolutely silent until she said it was over. She tucked him into the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, a cramped, dark space, but the safest place in the house. She gave him a blanket, a canteen of water, and the small wooden hawk Mangas had carved for him. "You be brave for me, Wyatt," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Just like your father." "Like the hawk," he whispered back, his eyes wide but trusting. She closed the heavy trap door, her heart breaking a little, as she slid a wooden chest over it. Mangas moved through the cabin like his namesake. He checked Cordelia's positioning at the front window, a narrow slit she'd created by propping a shutter open a few inches. He took the rear window for himself. The shotgun loaded with buckshot lay on the table between them, a last resort for close quarters. "They will come on horseback, loud and confident," he murmured, his voice a low rumble in the silent house. "They want to frighten you, to make you panic. Do not fire until I do. Let them get close. Let them feel safe." Cordelia nodded, her knuckles white, where she gripped the Winchester. Her breath was shallow, her senses screamingly alert. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, the thrum of blood in her ears. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Minutes stretched into eons. The moon rose, a pale, indifferent observer, casting long, dancing shadows across the yard. And then she heard it. The distant rhythmic drumming of horses' hooves. Not one rider, but several coming fast. Her breath hitched. Mangas laid a steadying hand on her shoulder for a brief moment. "Breathe slow," he commanded softly. "Your fear is a weapon. Let it make you sharp." The riders burst into the moonlit clearing in front of the cabin. There were 5 of them. Higgins was in the lead, astride a large, dark horse, looking smug and powerful. Pete and Lyle flanked him, and 2 other hard-faced men she didn't recognize, fanned-out rifles held ready. Cordelia Higgins's voice boomed across the yard, thick with false bonhomie. "A bit late for a social call, I know, but we saw you had no lights on." Worried something might be amiss. Silence from the cabin. "Come on out, my dear. No need to be frightened. We're just here to talk. My offer still stands. In fact, I'm feeling generous tonight. I'll even throw in the cost of the wagon to take you to Tucson." His men chuckled. It was a cruel, predatory sound. "Last chance," Cordelia Higgins yelled, his tone hardening. "I know you're in there. Don't make this difficult. I own this valley, and what I own, I keep." He gave a signal. Pete and another man dismounted, starting toward the porch, their boots crunching on the dry earth. They moved with a swaggering confidence, believing the house contained nothing more than a terrified woman. They were 20 yards away. Then 10. A sound split the night, not a gunshot, but a soft thwump. The man next to Pete grunted a strange questioning sound. He dropped his rifle, clutching at his throat, where the feathered shaft of an arrow now protruded. He staggered a few steps and collapsed in a heap. For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Ambush Lyle screamed, fumbling for his own rifle. Crack! The report of Cordelia's Winchester was deafening in the enclosed space. She had followed Mangus's instructions, aligning her sights on the center of Lyle's hulking frame. The big man was thrown backward off his horse as if punched by an invisible giant. Higgins and the remaining 2 men spurred their horses, diving for the cover of the horse corral, firing wildly at the dark cabin. Bullets splintered the logs, thudding into the walls around Cordelia. She ducked instinctively, her ears ringing the smell of gunpowder, sharp and acrid in her nostrils. "Reload," Mangus's voice commanded calm and steady from across the room. She could hear the smooth, practiced click of him, chambering another arrow. Another thwump from his position, followed by a curse of pain from the darkness outside. Her hands shook, but she forced them to obey. She worked the lever of the Winchester, ejecting the spent cartridge, chambering a fresh one. This was real. The men outside weren't just threats. They were flesh and blood, and she was in a fight for her life. The battle devolved into a tense standoff. Higgins and his remaining men were pinned down behind the corral fence. They would fire a volley at the cabin, and in the ensuing silence, Cordelia and Mangus would search for a target. The moon was both a blessing and a curse, offering just enough light to see, but also exposing any movement. Hours crawled by. The initial adrenaline gave way to a grim, exhausting focus. Cordelia's shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. Her throat was raw from breathing in the gun smoke. "They are trying to wait for the sun, Mangas," said his voice tight. "In the light, they believe they have the advantage." "What do we do?" she whispered back. "We bring the shadows to them." Before she could ask what he meant, he was moving. He grabbed a small clay pot from his belt pouch, one she hadn't noticed before. He crept to the side door, the one that led to the chicken coop. "Keep them busy," he ordered. He slipped out the door, vanishing into the night with a silence that defied belief. Cordelia's heart leapt into her throat. He had left her. She was alone. But then his words echoed. Keep them busy. It wasn't abandonment. It was a strategy. She was a part of his plan. Taking a deep breath, she fired 2 quick shots toward the corral, aiming for the top rail to send splinters flying. It worked. The 2 remaining henchmen and Higgins returned fire, concentrating on her window. Under the cover of their barrage, Mangas moved. He was a wraith, using the terrain he had studied so meticulously. He circled around the back of the property, coming up behind the corral from the direction of the creek bed. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the night, a terrifying high-pitched shriek that sounded like a cross between a bird of prey and a dying woman. It was a sound from a nightmare. One of Higgins's men yelled in panic. Then came the shriek again, this time from a different direction. Mangas was using the landscape to throw his voice to make it seem like they were surrounded. Then something sailed through the air, a dark arc against the moon. The clay pot Mangas had carried. It shattered against the dry wooden fence of the corral. It wasn't a bomb. It was filled with something thick and dark, pine pitch, and from the darkness, a single flaming arrow followed. The pitch ignited with a great whoosh. Flames erupted, climbing the dry fence posts, casting a flickering hellish light over the scene. The horses screamed in terror. Silhouetted against the new fire, Higgins and his 2 men were perfect targets. Cordelia didn't hesitate. She found Pete in her sights as he scrambled away from the fire and squeezed the trigger. He spun and fell. From the darkness, Mangas's bow sang twice more. The last henchman went down, an arrow in his chest. Now only Higgins was left. He had managed to get to his horse, frantically trying to control the panicked animal. He stared at the cabin, his face a mask of disbelief and fury in the firelight. Then he looked into the darkness, where Mangas was concealed. He was trapped between 2 implacable forces of vengeance. He made his choice. Spurring his horse brutally, he galloped away, not toward his ranch, but toward the open country, fleeing into the vast, dark wilderness. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning fence and the panicked whinnying of a lone horse left behind. Mangas emerged from the darkness, his bow in his hand, his face grim in the firelight. Cordelia slowly lowered her rifle, her body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of violence. They had survived the night. They had won. But it wasn't over. Higgins was still out there, and the dawn was coming. The fire at the corral burned itself out, leaving a smoldering black scar on the land. The night grew quiet again, but the peace was gone, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Cordelia retrieved Wyatt from the cellar. The boy was groggy, with sleep blinking in the lantern light, the sounds of the gunfight having been muffled enough to not fully wake him. She held him tight, the solid, warm weight of him, a grounding force in a world that had just been torn apart by bullets and flame. She put him back to bed this time in her own room and sat by his side until his breathing evened out. The men who had come to kill her were lying dead in her yard. The reality of it washed over her in waves of nausea and a strange cold clarity. She had taken a life to protect her own, The woman she was yesterday was gone forever. When she returned to the main room, Mangos was waiting. He had dragged the bodies away from the house, a grim piece of housekeeping. "He will be back," Cordelia stated, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. Mangas nodded. "He is a cornered animal. His ranch, his money, his power in the town. It is all built on a foundation of lies. You and I are the only ones who know the truth about Franklin. He cannot run and leave that truth behind him. He will circle back. He will try to finish it. He has no one left," she argued, wanting to believe it was over. "He has himself. And he is more dangerous now because he is desperate," Mangas replied. "He thinks I am still out there in the darkness. He will not expect me to be here in the light. He will come for the house. He will come for you." A new plan formed between them, spoken in low, urgent tones. There would be no more waiting, no more defense. They would set a trap and end it. The first hint of grey was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Mangas positioned himself. He did not hide in the cottonwoods or the ravine. He lay flat on the roof of the cabin, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire property, but made him almost invisible from the ground. Cordelia's role was the most dangerous. She was to be the bait. She lit a single lantern in the front window, creating a warm, inviting square of light, a perfect target. Then she sat at the kitchen table, in view of the window Franklin's Colt revolver on the table in front of her. She was to appear as a solitary, exhausted survivor, keeping a weary vigil. The shotgun was propped against the wall beside her, out of sight. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold, the world outside came into focus. The raw beauty of the dawn was a stark contrast to the grim tableau in the yard. And then she saw him. Bartholomew Higgins was on foot, creeping through the sparse brush at the edge of the property. He had abandoned his horse. He held a rifle in his hands, and his face, visible now in the growing light, was a mask of haggard desperation and murderous intent. All pretense of the civilized rancher was gone. He was a predator, stalking his prey. He moved slowly, cautiously, using the corral and the water trough for cover, his eyes fixed on the lighted window. On her. Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her hands to remain steady on the table. She had to look calm. She had to look alone. He reached the edge of the porch, crouching below the level of the windows. She could hear the soft scuff of his boots on the dirt. He was preparing for his final rush to burst through the door and finish what he'd started. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Her entire world narrowed to the sound of his breathing just outside her wall. Then Mangas acted. He didn't use his bow. This was too close, too personal. He dropped from the roof onto the porch with a soft thud. Higgins spun around, shock and terror warring on his face. He hadn't counted on this. He brought his rifle up, but Mangas was too fast. The Apache warrior moved like a blur, closing the distance between them. He knocked the rifle from Higgins's hands with a brutal blow from his bow. The two men crashed together. It was not a fight of skill, but of raw, primal fury. Higgins had weight and brute strength. Mangas had speed and a lifetime of relentless hardship. They grappled on the porch, their grunts and curses shattering the morning stillness. Cordelia flew to the door, shotgun in hand. She saw them locked together, a tangle of limbs. Higgins was trying to draw a pistol from his belt. She couldn't get a clear shot without hitting Mangas. Higgins broke free, shoving Mangas back. He raised his pistol, the barrel pointed squarely at the Apache's chest. Time slowed. Cordelia saw it all in perfect, terrible detail. The wild look in Higgins's eyes, the grim acceptance on Mangas's face. She didn't aim. She didn't think. She lifted the shotgun and fired. The blast was catastrophic at such close range. The buckshot tore through Higgins's side and arm, the force of it spinning him around. His pistol discharged into the porch floorboards as he fell screaming to his knees. He dropped the gun, clutching his ruined side, his face a portrait of agony and disbelief. Mangus stood over him, his chest heaving, his knife now in his hand. He looked from the whimpering, bleeding man on the floor to Cordelia, who stood frozen, the smoking shotgun still in her hands. The sun broke fully over the mountains, flooding the porch with golden light. It was dawn. Mangus looked at Cordelia, his dark eyes holding hers. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Acknowledgement. Respect. He then turned his attention back to Higgins. "This is for Franklin Thompson," he said, his voice low and final. He knelt, and the morning sun caught the glint of his blade. Cordelia turned away, her duty done. She walked back into the cabin, leaning the shotgun against the wall, her body trembling uncontrollably. She did not need to see any more. Justice raw and brutal had been served. The debt was paid. She went to the window and looked out at the rising sun. A new day was beginning, built on the ashes of the old. The chilling promise that had been delivered in twilight now found its resolution in the dawn. She was free, but she was not the same, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was no longer alone. The hours that followed were a surreal blur. While Mangus dealt with the grim necessities outside, Cordelia moved through the cabin, scrubbing away the lingering scent of gunpowder and fear. She was creating order from chaos, packing away the violence of the night. By the time she stepped back onto the porch, the yard was clear. The only evidence of the siege was the splintered wood of the cabin walls and the charred remains of the corral. As if summoned by the battle's end, a dust cloud on the horizon resolved into two riders, Sheriff Brody and a sterner-looking man wearing the badge of a U.S. Marshal. Mangus had foreseen this, having sent a runner to the Marshal's office in Tucson before the fighting began, bypassing the ineffectual Brody entirely. Marshal Kia Vent dismounted, his sharp eyes taking in the scene of a desperate defense. "Ma'am," he began, his voice firm but respectful. There was a report of a dispute. Cordelia met his gaze without flinching, her voice cold and precise. "Bartholomew Higgins and his men attacked my home last night, Marshal. They came to kill me and my son because I learned he murdered my husband Franklin for this land. She told him everything, the dam, the harassment, the poison." As she finished, Mangus stepped forward from the side of the barn. "And who is this?" the Marshal asked. "This is Mangus," Cordelia said, using his Apache name for the first time in public, a clear declaration of their alliance. "He was a friend of my husband. He protected us." Mangus presented the Marshal with the pouch containing the dried knight's kiss flower. "The truth is written on the land," he stated. Marshal Kia Vent, a man who knew justice in the territories, rarely wore a badge, saw the truth in their eyes. His investigation was swift and decisive. By evening, the dam was found, and Higgins's foreman had confessed. The official record would state that Higgins and his men were killed while resisting arrest for the murder of Franklin Thompson, a neater truth for the town's ledgers. The law departed, and a profound quiet finally settled over the cinder basin. That evening, Cordelia stood on the porch as Mangus approached. His gear gathered, his bow in hand. The debt was paid. The vow was fulfilled. "You'll be safe now," he said. "Because of you," she replied softly, turning to face him. "Your promise. By dawn you'll belong to me alone." "I understand it now. It wasn't about possession. It is a vow of the Ende," he explained, his voice low and steady. "It means your fire becomes my fire. Your path and mine are one until the danger is past. It is not about owning. It is about belonging, together, against the world. A vast, potent silence opened between them. He was free to return to the mountains, and she was free to live her life. The choice hung in the twilight air. "Is the danger past, Mangus?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked from her resilient face to her son Wyatt, who was playing safely in the yard. He saw a different kind of wilderness here, one of a hearth and home. He did not answer with words. Instead, he slowly unstrung his bow, a gesture of peace, of a hunt concluded. He leaned it against the porch wall. He was staying. Cordelia's heart, long hardened by grief, felt a sudden warmth. They were a strange, unlikely alliance, the widow, the boy, and the Apache warrior, bound not by blood, but by a promise made in the dust and sealed at dawn. They belonged together. And so, in the heart of the unforgiving West, the story of Cordelia May Thompson and the Apache hunter, known as Mangus, became a whispered legend. It wasn't a tale of romance in the traditional sense, but something deeper, a story of honor, resilience, and how the deepest bonds are forged in the fires of adversity. It reminds us that family isn't always the one you're born into, but the one you fight for. The chilling promise. By dawn you'll belong to me alone, transformed from a terrifying threat of ownership into a profound vow of protection, a testament to a loyalty that transcended culture, race, and the written law. It's a story that proves, even in the most desolate landscapes, courage and an unbreakable promise can make a new world bloom. If this story of the Wild West captured your imagination, and you want to hear more tales of grit, justice, and the untamed frontier, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves a good old-fashioned Western, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep these legends alive. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Cordelia's and Mangus's journey. Thank you for listening.